gender identification, sexuality. There are other things which we don't talk about as often, but they're probably worse. Things like religious background, think Northern Ireland, or political views, think the United States. The thing is, if you look at these factors, they may be very important to you as part of your own self-identification, but they don't affect your ability to love, to be loved in return, or to join in a covenant with others who may be different from you, or the same as you. A rich, diverse community glued together by love gives us perspectives and models that go far beyond those which we can find in any other way. As long as you're willing to accept others as they are and to have others accept you as you are, and that's not always an easy thing either, you belong here. So welcome, everyone, to our sacred space. At this point, we come to the official beginning of our service in the lighting of our chalice. And I would invite you to join with me in the unison reading. It's called Our Covenant. If you have the old pew card, that's not the right one. It says Our Covenant. Okay? We cultivate trust with one another by celebrating differences, honoring boundaries, and offering compassion and care. We listen to each other deeply with curiosity and wonder. We speak for ourselves without the need to defend ourselves or persuade each other. We create safe and brave space for healthy conflict, creativity, and fun. We reconcile through forgiving and making amends when we hurt one another.
Well, good morning. Are we the aliens, after all? Sometimes the world can be a scary and strange place. And when you think about it, so much of our lives is spent trying to figure out ways how not to be in the world. Even if you're an exceptionally dedicated naturalist, most of your time is spent in a building, you're separated from the world. If you have some plants, for example, probably they're in some pots or in like a special garden area. Almost certainly, if you have animals around, they are either on a leash or in a loved pet bed. They're not usually wild animals that are coming in and out of your lives. And the thing is, we have a culture full of stories about aliens from other places, other planets, coming to us. And a fair question might be, if we do so much to reshape the world to fit us, are we the aliens after all? We are here as a people who cares about the dignity of our whole humanity, which includes our interdependence with the world. It's a world that shapes us even as we shape it. But today we're going to meditate on what it might be like to understand our own alien-like status on planet Earth, with the hope of understanding that how we've been alienated from the planet can help us understand how to make peace with our fears and our anxieties, all of the things that push us to see ourselves as something removed from nature, something perhaps above nature. So in that spirit, I'd like to ask everybody to share a tentacle or a monster claw with one of your fellow neighbors as we greet one another this morning. This is the time in our worship together where we gather to share the joys and concerns that weigh upon us, that occupy us, that are the center of our lives this time. We have a very special joy to share today. We have Joyce Wallace, I believe, is right here with us, who is celebrating her 95th birthday today. So thrilled to have you with us, Joyce. For those of us worshiping online this morning, we're so glad that you are with us. If you would like to and feel compelled to share, please do so in the chat feature on the window. Those of us who are here present, I invite you to bring your joy and concern here and share it with us by placing a stone in our bowl of water. In our opening hymn, we sung about a coral reef, not a word that comes in every hymn that we sing here. And it's hard not to look at this bowl and not see a little reef of joy and concern that we've brought today. We, of course, add a stone for all of those joys and concerns that were shared digitally this morning on our live stream. We also include a stone for any joys and concerns that go unspoken today, that are still in the vaults of our hearts.
I'm going to tell you all a story this morning. It's about a bird. Well, a species of bird. They were streamlined and wonderful flyers that were unbelievably common in this area. Indeed, at their peak, they were probably the most abundant bird in North America, if not the entire world. Take yourself back to 1850. At that point, a 20-year-old Potawatomi tribal leader was camping in Michigan when he heard a far-off gurgling sound that startled him. It seemed like, to quote him, an army of horses laden with sleigh bells was advancing through the deep forests towards me. As I listened more intently, I concluded that instead of trampling of horses, it was distant thunder. And yet the morning was clear and calm and beautiful. The sound came nearer and nearer until he finally discovered the source. While I gazed in wonder and astonishment, I beheld moving toward me an unbroken flock of millions of pigeons. He described how a traveling flock, arriving at a deep valley, would pour its living mass hundreds of feet in a downward plunge. He says, "I've stood by the grandest waterfall of America, and yet never in my astonishment, wonder, and admiration has been so stirred as when I have witnessed these birds drop from their course like meteors from heaven." Well, he was a tribal leader from the Potawatomi. The Native Americans had been living with the passenger pigeon for 10,000 years. They had strict taboos for hunting them, and although the pigeons provided a significant portion of the diet of many Indian tribes in this area, the taboos based on both religion and science and experience ensured their sustainability. John James Audubon, you've heard of him, it's the Audubon, encountered a very large flight of pigeons along the Ohio River in Kentucky, and he said he was struck with amazement. The air was literally filled with pigeons. The light of the noonday was obscured as by an eclipse. The dung fell in spots, not unlike melting flakes of snow. I dismounted and began to mark with my pencil, making a dot for every flock that passed. In a short time, finding the task which I'd undertaken impracticable as the birds poured in countless multitudes, I rose and, counting the dots that I had then put down, found that 163 had been made in 21 minutes. Remember, these are not birds, they're flocks. I traveled on and met still more the further I proceeded. He later calculated that in that day he'd seen well over 1 billion birds. I mention Audubon because in the last quarter of the 19th century, it was a time of great settlement of the Midwest by white settlers. Now, these settlers believed that they could do anything and everything better than anybody else, especially those Native Americans. They weren't they weren't encumbered by the taboos of the Native American tribes. They actively cut down the forests that had provided acorns and beech nuts that the pigeons fed on. When the flocks arrived in their towns, people would drop everything and have several days of pigeon hunting. Well, pigeon hunting could involve sending cannons filled with buckshot. You could take a double-barreled shotgun and go blam blam into the densest part of the flock and get about 5 dozen dead birds. You've heard of there were giant nets that could net over 3,500 birds at once. Some of the most striking words in our language come from the passenger pigeon. You've heard of stool pigeons, trap shooting. These are all related to the hunting of the passenger pigeon by the white settlers. As the railroads increased their coverage of the Midwest, it became both possible and profitable to send millions of pigeons east to the East Coast to restaurants and butcher shops. The demise of the pigeon was amazingly fast. The last stand was in Michigan, and it took about 11 years from the time when market hunters could have a major slaughter to send east and total extinction in the state. The last living passenger pigeon, she was a female named Martha. Her mate had been George, as in Washington. She died in the Cincinnati Zoo in 1914. We know that passenger pigeons clearly had a tremendous effect on the ecological nature of the forests in their natural range. The story of the passenger pigeon is one of the strongest cases against the destructive power of technology. In this case, it was firearms and railroads, neither of which the Native Americans had, and the hubris of white settlers over the successful management practices of the Native Americans. Doesn't mean the technology is bad or that what we do is bad. It means that we need to be aware. And the passenger pigeon is a wonderful parallel for things that can go wrong. In 1947, the Wisconsin Society of Ornithology dedicated a monument to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the extinction of the passenger pigeon in Wisconsin. And I'd like to quote from an essay presented for the dedication of this monument by one of the great premier naturalists of the mid-20th century, Aldo Leopold. And remember that this precedes the first Earth Day by almost 25 years. Words of Aldo Leopold. We've erected a monument to commemorate the funeral of a species. It symbolizes our sorrow. We grieve because no living man will ever again see the onrushing phalanx of victorious birds sweeping a path for spring across the March skies, chasing the defeated winter from all the woods and prairies of Wisconsin. Men still live who in their youth remember pigeons. Trees still live who in their youth were shaken by a violent wind, a living wind. But a decade hence, only the oldest oaks will remember, and at long last, only the hills will know. There will always be pigeons in books and in museums, but these are effigies and images, dead to all the hardships and to all the delights. Book pigeons cannot dive out of a cloud to make the deer run for cover, or clap their wings in thunderous applause of mast-laden woods. Book pigeons cannot breakfast on new-mown wheat in Minnesota and dine on blueberries in Canada. They know no urge of seasons, they feel no kiss of sun, no lash of wind and weather. They live forever by not living at all. Our grandfathers were less well-housed, well-fed, well-clothed than we are. The strivings by which they bettered their lot are also those which deprived us of pigeons. Perhaps we now grieve because we are not sure in our hearts that we have gained by this exchange. The gadgets of industry bring us more comforts than the pigeons did, but do they add as much to the glory of the spring? For one species to mourn the death of another is a new thing under the sun. The Cro-Magnon who slew the last mammoth thought only of steaks. The sportsman who shot the last pigeon thought only of his prowess. Incidentally, the last pigeon to be shot was in Pike County, Ohio. His name was Buttons. But we who've lost our pigeons mourn the loss. Had the funeral been ours, the pigeons would hardly have mourned us. In this fact, rather than our modern technology, lies objective evidence of our superiority over the beasts. Allan was trying to get me to cut my talk short, but that is one of the most beautiful evocations that I have ever thought of just what it means to have nature. And appropriately, our offering partner this morning is the Riddall Green Partnership, Urban Agriculture and Youth Education. Now, worship associates typically go online to the websites of our offering partners to see how they describe themselves in their own words so that we can use their words to tell you why you should give money to them. Well, I did that, and it seemed to me, based on their website, that they were trying to do so much, everything for everybody. It didn't seem to make sense to me. So I went and visited them. You all know the saying, you can feed a person for a day by giving them a fish. You can feed them for a lifetime if you teach them how to fish. This is the idea behind Riddall. It's a full-blown demonstration-scale operating urban farm located in one of Cleveland's food deserts on the east side. It's the Forgotten Triangle off the Opportunity Corridor near East 79th Street. Part of their mission is an educational program whose motto might be, you want to raise some of your own food? We'll show you what you can do and teach you how to do it. When you arrive at their campus, you become aware of a number of greenhouses and other buildings. Inside those buildings are many of the things that a Clevelander might want to grow. Some are on the exotic side, but most are food. You want vegetables? They have chard and beets and collards and tomatoes and peppers and eggplants and melons. They're the most beautiful vegetables I think I've ever seen. And they're organic. You want protein? They have tilapia. You want fruit? They have peaches and apples and elderberries and apricots. You want community outreach? They've got a place where veterans with PTSD can come and chill and volunteer to work in the gardens if they choose to. You want pollinators? They have bees. Your soil isn't very good? They'll help you make fertile soil with compostable materials. They have an educational program that brings people in for a 5.5-week course in how to grow these things. What impressed me is that this is a place that has the system down, from the soil to what you can eat. And it's a resource that represents the very best in a version of environmental activism that we don't see as much as we'd like to, and which we can be proud to support. So please give generously. If you happen to be online, or if you prefer to, you can use our Cash App. It's $UUCC, what's it, 441121? Which one, 22? Yes, 22. And be sure, if you use the Cash App, to add either plate or rid all in the subject line.
We have been changing our acceptance of gifts to do a little experimenting this summer. And this particular day, we were hoping to read from the song We Give Thanks. If you'll join me, the words are in your order of service. Oh, we give thanks for this precious day, for all gathered here and those far away. For this time we share with love and care. Oh, we give thanks for this precious day. So I love Grover, the Muppet. It's without a doubt my favorite Muppet, and beyond that, very much my favorite monster. And this is my favorite story about Grover. If you don't know this story, I am so sorry that your childhood was robbed of this monument of experimental fiction, the monster at the end of this book. You know this one? Anyone? Okay. We are a large group, so I can't really tell the whole story. It's hard to do that with this sort of size, and seeing the pictures is really important. So I'll give you the gist. Grover greets you in this story. You're having a conversation with Grover. And all he knows is that from the title, there's a monster at the end of this book. And the entire book is Grover lamenting and sweating and full of anxiety because you keep turning pages. Until he says, oh no, you turned another page. Because why would you keep turning pages? There's a monster at the end of this book. Don't do that. And then he gets ropes out, and I believe there's brick and mortar. It's a whole thing. And then of course what's great at the end is, guess who the monster at the end of the book is? It's Grover. He was there the whole time. Which leads to, without a doubt, my favorite page, possibly in all of literature, is Grover, the very final page. Oh, I'm so embarrassed. Little meta-commentary from Grover. My favorite monster. I think monsters are actually extremely important. Important for us, important to understand ourselves, but also important to understand our relationship to the world. I mean, you think about that final phrase, I'm so embarrassed, Grover having this great realization. I can't say I had this thought when I was first reading this book as, like a 4-year-old or something, but a valid question to me is, what monster did Grover have in mind? Like, what was he afraid of? What did he imagine was going to be the monster at the end? And I sort of imagined, do you think it was like a Muppet Frankenstein? Like, actually easier to make than you would think, because a Muppet, you just pull the parts together and sew them back. That's not weird for a Muppet. But maybe it's a ferocious animal, maybe it was like a creepy otherworldly alien, was another thought. Theorists and philosophers and theologians actually make a great deal of monsters. We don't always think about this, but monsters are such a huge part of our mythology, our imagination. They group these together often, monsters and aliens, along with, these are so great to me, along with ghosts and gods. Gods, ghosts, monsters, aliens. A monster, by definition, is a bunch of scary things all stuck together. That's pretty frightening. A ghost, a thing that persists even after death. An alien, a thing that is by definition something that is a stranger. It's a threatening agent from outside that you don't understand and maybe doesn't understand you. And then, of course, a god. Well, what is a god? A powerful entity whose arbitrary power dictates what happens in the world. Do we see ourselves in some of these things that we're afraid of? Are we like Grover? Were we the monsters the whole time? Actually, calls to mind a favorite quote of mine. One of the most beautiful TV shows I've ever watched is on HBO. It's called Station 11. And in a pivotal scene, one of the characters reflects on something that's actually appeared in a graphic novel, a comic book. And the phrase is, to the monsters, we're the monsters. It's just monsters all the way down. I shared this week a little bit about this feeling of fear and fright and scariness, and how that's reflected in nature. And unsurprisingly, if you're looking at something that looks monstrous from the natural world, the natural place to go is Australia, where all of the most frightening alien things can be seen. And I invite anyone, please, the video I shared this week is without a doubt one of the creepiest, weirdest things. And that's where monster turns into alien. I think for us in our kind of sci-fi rubric, an alien is usually just monster plus technology. It's just a monster, but with a spaceship, basically. But at its root, I think there's something really essential to this idea of what is alien to us, because it really gets down to that anxiety that happens when we confront something that's truly different, truly separate from who we are. I think about that with Aldo Leopold's reflection that Pete shared before. In there, Aldo Leopold uses language for these flocks of these birds, and he describes a feathered tempest and a traveling blast of life. You can imagine how you would see that as something strange and unfamiliar and threatening. And of course, that would drive you to do so many things out of fear that would make you no longer the one afraid of the monsters, but actually the monster all along. So it comes back to Grover, because I think Grover invites us not to, I'm posing it as, are we the aliens? But maybe a better way of saying this is that monsters and aliens, these are things we can think with. We can see the world, we can see ourselves alongside these things, because they tell us so much about our fears and our anxieties. And when you think about the idea of aliens and these strangers that are outside of ourselves, there's really sort of two ways you become an alien. One is you're from somewhere else, and you've arrived in a place that is not your home. You're an alien in this place. That's its most basic sense. An alien is a stranger, somebody who comes to your town, your tribe, your group, who is from elsewhere. But you can also become an alien, because we're alienated from people, from places, from things, from our jobs, from our social groups. Alienation is what happens when you find yourself separated and removed. It's actually another one of these really important ideas, along with monsters, that theorists and philosophers and theologians talk about, this idea of alienation. Because to become an alien, to be alienated, it has something to do with breaking a thing into its parts and never seeing the entire whole. That's one way of thinking about being alienated. Maybe you have a fight with a very good friend, and that fight becomes the whole of your whole friendship, even though there's all this other stuff going on, a whole set of relationships, but it's become about this one thing, alienation. I was actually trying to think about a way to illustrate this, and the best example I could think of actually comes from an old labor joke, an old joke about factory workers. And the joke goes that there's a guy who's the day of his retirement. He's been working in a factory for 40 years. And so, of course, all the young people are there, and they're ribbing him and saying, hey, what are you going to do now that you're retired? What's the first thing you're going to do now that you finally wrapped up 40 years on this factory line doing the same job over and over again? Are you going to go fishing? Are you going to go golfing? Are you going to go just sleep for a week? What are you going to do? And he says, well, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to finally travel to the end of this factory and figure out what I've been making all these years. Alienation, a way of breaking a thing into its parts and not connecting to the whole. It's our disembodiedness. It's our way of not understanding ourselves in the natural world. And so we become aliens. We become the monsters. We harm and exploit nature, as Aldo Leopold so poignantly reflected. More of that, we also become like gods. We think of ourselves above, separate from, dictating down onto this earth that is our thing to talk about. We make ourselves like aliens. Not aliens from another planet, but aliens in our own home. Now, an important thing to note, and I say this because this is such an urgent issue, but before we turn to the what can we do about this part of the message this morning, there's an important caveat here, which is that no one here, none of you is responsible for or even possibly could deindustrialize the world. That's not in our power. In fact, that's classic God thinking. We're above it. We can fix it. We're little saviors up here. We can save all this stuff down here. That's not a thing we can necessarily do. Even if we're working for ecological justice, even when we are doing everything that we can do, what we can't do is undo hundreds and hundreds of years of human experience. But religious naturalism, this theme we're talking about this summer, all of it is about a resource for de-alienating our experience of nature. A new way of understanding how we are monsters and aliens in the world. A little bit like what Grover realizes at the end when he's so embarrassed. It invites us into a different relationship with our status with the world. So I have a few thoughts about this. One is, and this is absolutely Grover's lesson, it's all about fear. It is all about fear and anxiety. Aldo Leopold referenced it as well. This fear, this concern, this anxiety to survive, to thrive, that makes you do anything. This made me actually think of the resources. This made me think of a great book by the novelist John Green. He wrote a book called The Anthropocene Reviewed. Strongly recommend it. Reflections on being a human in this strange time that we're in. And he gets into some of the ways that a kind of religious naturalism gives us resources to de-alienate ourselves from that fear. And what he talks about is his initial efforts. I think they were especially flourishing for him during the pandemic, building a garden. And of course, as anyone here who has ever built a garden before, I'm sure many of us have, animals are a problem sometimes. Because the animals, they want what you got. That's where they want to be, for sure. You're growing all this beautiful, wonderful food. That's what the animals want. And what John Green says is that he's looking on the internet, he's researching, he's trying to figure out ways to deal with these groundhogs he has. And he's thinking about all these different ways, but he doesn't really want to get out the baseball bat and start becoming a real monster. So he's trying to find some other ways. And then he finally reads something from some far-flung corner of the internet. And you know what the advice he got was? It was, build a garden for your groundhogs. Separate your garden, but then also make sure they have a place that's just for them. And let them flourish and grow in this diverting garden elsewhere. And so the chance to be something monstrous turns into an opportunity to connect in a deeper way. Another part of this that I think is so important, especially to us who are so thoughtful and sensitive to the political and policy-based responses we can have to the world. Because those are, of course, so important. We are constantly remaking the world. There are ways to intervene and to bring us back into connection. But of course, the problem is that work sometimes is part of the alienating process. We abstract the earth and nature into policy and into political involvements. We lose our connection to nature itself. Actually, I just saw a wonderful thing on social media from a musician I deeply love named Tyler Childers. Tyler Childers is a full-blown Appalachian singer-songwriter. And what he talked about is that now that he's received a decent amount of acclaim and success, he's now made it a deliberate part of his life to never be on tour for more than a couple of months. Because he knows if he gets away from the place that he's from, he'll lose all of that perspective. So we can work for justice, but we shouldn't lose touch with our own connection to the earth. I think our final lesson can come from Grover's embarrassment. And I would say this from the deepest part of me. Embrace your spiritual self. If you aren't yet, if you don't think of yourself this way, become a spiritual monster. A spiritual person is able to see the whole and not the parts. A spiritual person is wrapped up in that interdependent web that we talk about so much. Your spiritual self is the one that can see the natural world and not see something separate and alien, but see it as an extension of yourself. Spiritual selves are what allow us to do the opposite of alienation. Are we the aliens? I hope that question now strikes us as a different way of seeing our relationship to the natural world. And Grover is a model for this pathway towards a new kind of enlightenment, a new kind of understanding about how we relate and how we connect, and how all of this fear and anxiety that so often drives our sense of who we are can give way to a different kind of, perhaps embarrassed, understanding of ourselves. For anyone who would like to join me for a little monster mash session during our Soul Matters conversations during coffee hour, I'd like to talk about our experience of our own monstrousness, our own alienation, in ways that allow us to understand our place in the world in a bigger way. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, and you've all already sat down, so I don't have to say please be seated. A rare occurrence here in the middle of July, without a doubt our most thriving time here at UUCC. There's no announcements. So I guess that means nothing is happening. Oh, something over here? I was wrong. The most important thing is happening today, for sure. I also do know that our Buddhist temple is celebrating Oban today at this afternoon. I'm not sure exactly the time. That's not on our calendar, but they are, I believe, over in the East Lawn. So that's just an FYI, a friendly FYI. Embracing our alienness is a way of acknowledging that our next best step is always clear to us. It's to know one another more deeply, to be more curious about the world, and to be friendly with questions and mysteries. I hope that all of us can go out today full of a desire to connect with the natural world in a way that is appropriate to an alien with lots of tentacles and many eyes, curious and searching. On the other side of our fears is a world truly ready to become our home. Amen, and blessed be.
One final note. I'm not sure how many of you noticed this, but thinking about natural aliens, that beautiful hymn that we just sang, the tune title, not the hymn title, but the tune title was Chernobyl. Anyway, as we come to the end of our service today, will you read along with me from your pew card our final words to each other? We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.